Welcome to Iowa Homeland Security and Emergency Management's video series on your rights and responsibilities as a subapplicant in the Public Assistance Program. This video will discuss funding opportunities under Section 1206 of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, sometimes known as DRRA or DRRA. Strong building codes save lives and property. Section 1206 provides resources to effectively administer and enforce locally adopted building codes and floodplain management ordinances for a period of up to 180 days from the date of presidential declaration of a major disaster. This ultimately helps communities avoid damages in the future. If you want to be sure of the declaration date, visit fema.gov/disaster/declarations and search for Iowa in recently declared. Look for the declared on date and add 180 days. So who can use these funds? All state, local, and tribal governments in communities designated for public assistance, known as PA, for permanent work. Note that distinction. If a community is only designated for PA emergency work, DRRA 1206 does not apply. Note also that DRRA 1206 funds cannot be provided to communities that are suspended or sanctioned for not participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. This usually happens when FEMA has issued a flood insurance rate map or firm identifying a special flood hazard area within the community's boundaries, but the community has, for whatever reason, not yet joined the NFIP. There are many reasons why your community might not participate in NFIP, but we would encourage participation where feasible. Another reason to participate is that the state's 10% cost share for PA projects after a flood is contingent on the community being in good standing with NFIP. See Iowa Code 455B.262A for more. If you want up-to-date information on your community's status in the NFIP, reach out to HSEMD or the State NFIP Coordinator at DNR, or visit FEMA's Community Status Book website at fema.gov/CIS/IA.pdf. This site is updated daily. Now that we know who can use 1206 funds, what can we do with them? Administer and enforce state and locally adopted building codes and floodplain management ordinances. Unlike other types of public assistance under the Stafford Act Section 406, work eligible under DRRA Section 1206 may include costs related to the entire community's building stock, meaning public, private, residential, etc. It is not restricted to facilities the applicant has a legal responsibility to repair. However, DRRA is restricted to costs incurred within 180 days of the major disaster declaration, not to be confused with the disaster incident period, which could last for days or weeks. But the incident period is important because any work performed starting on the first day of the incident period could be eligible. Again, the incident period can be found on FEMA's website with recently declared disasters. Revenue collected for code enforcement activities, such as fees or fines, is considered program income, which reduces the eligible amount for reimbursement. This revenue must be reported and will be accounted for during grant closeout. If you're interested in 1206 support, contact Iowa HSEMD. Follow the same procedures and requirements for other PA-funded projects, and be sure to retain and submit all documentation needed to demonstrate the work completed and where it was located. This includes any work that was completed through an emergency mutual assistance compact. If work was performed by contract labor, be sure to show that federal procurement rules at 2 CFR Part 200 were followed. In order to show that the activities being reimbursed support the legally adopted building code or floodplain management ordinance, FEMA may require further documentation, such as documentation of administration and enforcement, disaster-related development inspections, and substantial damage inspections, determinations, letters, and appeals. You can find more policy resources in the PA Companion Guide for DRRA 1206, linked to here. Notably, while DRRA 1206 supports enforcement of building codes, it cannot be used to adopt new building codes. Newer building codes reflect the latest and greatest in building science and safety, as well as current practices in the building industry, but outdated codes are not a result of the disaster and are therefore not eligible. If you are interested in assistance for updating your building codes, zoning codes, or land use plans that can mitigate natural hazard impacts, contact HSEMD Mitigation at iowa.gov to discuss available funds. Let's get into a little more detail about what you can do with the funds. We'll start with the administration and enforcement of building codes and then move to floodplain ordinance administration and enforcement. For building code administration, you can review and process applications for building permits, certificates of occupancy or compliance, and construction documents. You can process requests for building code variances, collect fees, hire, train, supervise, certify, and license staff as required to conduct eligible activities. You can contract for services, including, for example, contract planning, initiation, solicitation, evaluation, and award. You can provide training and information to staff, contractors, and the public on unique considerations for repair of disaster-damaged historic buildings, provide training and outreach to the public on building code and building permit requirements applicable to the repair, replacement, or retrofit of disaster-damaged buildings, establish construction plan review and inspection processes, procedures, and instructions for permit holders, monitor impacted areas for unpermitted construction activities, and coordinate building code administration and enforcement with floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement as appropriate. Regarding code enforcement, you can inspect structures under construction for compliance with approved plans, specifications, and all requirements of applicable codes, laws, and ordinances. You can identify and carry out corrective action in cases where construction design and occupancy do not comply with codes or ordinances. You can conduct and process condemnation determinations, review and issue elevation certificates, and investigate complaints and assist in preparation of materials for abating violations of building codes and related ordinances. When it comes to floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement, you can enforce or administer standards for development according to community floodplain management regulations. Determine whether proposed disaster-related development activities are in areas regulated by the community's floodplain management ordinance or building code. You can hire, train, supervise, certify, and license staff as required to conduct eligible activities. You can contract for services, for instance, contract planning, initiation, solicitation, evaluation, and award. You can provide training and outreach to the public on floodplain permit requirements applicable to the repair, replacement, or retrofit of disaster-damaged buildings. You can provide training and information to staff, contractors, and the public on unique considerations for repair of disaster-damaged historic buildings, review disaster-related development proposals to ensure compliance with the requirements of applicable floodplain management ordinances, process permits for disaster-related development in the floodplain associated with the declared disaster, inspect all disaster-related development in the applicable jurisdiction, monitor impacted areas for unpermitted construction activities, and process requests for floodplain management ordinance variances. You can also process, maintain, and track temporary occupancy permits and inspect temporary occupancy buildings, provide information on flood hazards, floodplain map data, advisory flood data, and compliance to residents and property owners. You can conduct inspections to ensure the removal of temporary fill and related materials used in flood fighting, take corrective action necessary to ensure compliance with federal, state, and local floodplain regulations, and coordinate floodplain management ordinance administration and enforcement with that of building codes. Within floodplain management ordinances, there's also something called substantial damage determinations. For existing buildings located in areas regulated by the floodplain ordinance or building code, eligible work may include work to conduct initial field surveys to determine the extent of damage, establish damage trends to identify areas to focus building-specific assessment efforts, prepare cost information on repairs and pre-disaster market value estimates for substantial damage estimates, hire, train, supervise, certify, and license staff as required to conduct eligible activities, collect field data for damage assessments, enter damage inventory administrative data into the substantial damage estimator or comparable data collection software, track cumulative substantial damage and repetitive loss for communities if required, and conduct damage inventory of structures. For substantial damage determinations, you can also inform property owners of damage determinations and provide compliance requirements, perform inspections to ensure compliance with repair and substantial damage construction requirements, determine whether proposed improvements are substantial improvements and trigger requirements for compliance, including a building permit, determine if damaged structures have been designated as historic or that may be eligible for such designation, review, adjudicate, and resolve substantial damage determination appeals. Now let's get into some of the costs that will be eligible. Note that the cost share for DRRA 1206 activities will be the same as other PA permanent work under the disaster. Again, only work within 180 days of the disaster declaration is eligible. This cannot be extended. For employees who are budgeted, only their overtime will be eligible. For extra hires or unbudgeted contract work, straight time and overtime are eligible, along with potentially costs for travel, accommodations, per diem, etc., where appropriate. The purchase of supplies and equipment necessary to effectively execute activities described in the DRRA 1206 policy are subject to requirements established in the PAPPG or PAPAG and 2 CFR Part 200. For work done under Mutual Aid or Emergency Management Assistance Compacts, EMAC, costs will be reimbursed according to provisions established in the PAPAG. Costs associated with legal proceedings related to enforcement of code and floodplain management ordinances are eligible for reimbursement. And finally, as a reminder, revenue collected by the applicant, including fees and fines for the performance of eligible work under this policy, is considered program income. FEMA will deduct the income from the total project costs as specified in 2 CFR 200.80 and 200.307. If the applicant waives fees or fines following the disaster, FEMA will still reduce the eligible costs by the amount that the fees or fines would have been. Understandably, you may want to reduce burden on your community following a disaster, but this will come out of your reimbursement from FEMA either way. There's a lot going on here, so plan ahead to make your assistance under DRRA 1206 go smoothly. Keep records of anything relevant to disaster-related work, even if a major disaster has not yet been declared. A declaration may come later. Keep your receipts, activity logs, sign-in sheets, substantial damage assessments, etc. And keep in mind potential program income and the cost shares between federal, state, and local governments. Hopefully by now you feel more comfortable in your understanding of DRRA 1206 assistance for administering and enforcing building codes and floodplain ordinances. If any questions remain, please reach out to your point of contact at Iowa HSEMD or the HSEMD PA mailbox listed here. You can also visit FEMA.gov and search DRRA 1206 or follow the link here.